Hey everybody, welcome back to another NDBI Navigator Narratives, highlighting the voices of NDBI researchers and practitioners. I am incredibly excited to have you all get to listen with Dr. Pamela Rollins today, who is a professor in the Department of Speech, Language, and Hearing at the University of Texas at Dallas. Pamela, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, we've had unofficial off-channel chats, and it just excites me so much to hear you officially on the podcast so people get to hear your voice and listen to what you've been up to over the past X amount of decades of research and practice that you've been doing. You are a wealth of information and experience, and getting people to get to know you a little bit better is something that I'm very excited about. Before we dig into some of the stuff that you've been up to, can you share a little bit more about your background, kind of how you got started, what you've been doing, where you're at now?
Okay. Well, I don't know if we have that much time, but I started in being interested in autism in 1982. So a real long time ago. I was a student at the University of Wisconsin, and I actually got so much into autism. I was teaching the autism classes for all my professors, and I worked at Mendota Mental Health Institute. It was a um, locked ward for in a deinstitutionalized state, and it was a full ABA ward. And in those days, they put kids into timeout boxes,
Mm.
and it was just very strict ABA. Glenn Sallows, who has written some good ABA articles, he was the head of my unit. And I came from the beginning, it was the beginning of the social pragmatic revolution in speech and language. So here I was trying to do social pragmatic therapy from what we knew about it in this fully ABA unit, right? And so it was easy to mix. I mean, that's really NDBI. I was doing what we knew about development in those days, as well as mixing it with the ABA. And then I went off to work at Brown University with Barry Prezant, Dr. Barry Prezant, who's one of the SERTS model people. And I worked with him for a couple of years, but I kept saying, if autistic kids have social problems, what do typical kids do? And in those days, we didn't know what the typical trajectory of pragmatic skills was or social skills really in typical kids were. So I went off to study with Catherine Snow at Harvard University to really look at what typical kids were doing. And she is a person who is one of the first people to talk about motherese and mother-child interaction and those types of things. And so really looking at what that interaction looks like in typical kids. My dissertation found that joint attention was important for language. It was one of the first empirical studies to look at that. And so I really then pulled back and spent the rest of my career trying to figure out, how do you get to joint attention? If kids on the spectrum didn't have joint attention or had problems with joint attention, how do we get there? Because as a speech pathologist and as a developmentalist, I was not going to take no for an answer.
Yes, that's incredible. I know it's one of the first studies. It really is such an important predictor of language. And so being able to identify where does that joint attention come from and all of the pre-skills that kind of line things up to help that happen from a social communicative perspective, I think is incredibly valuable to look at. And I know you've done a lot of research and have been looking at, words are not enough, right? There's so much more to how interactions are shaped and communication is laid out for any child, especially the ones that we are supporting that are a bit delayed or have challenges or barriers to actually showing that. And
And in
yeah.
But we have kids, especially kids, autistic kids who learn language, who learn words, but they're using them for instrumental purposes, for regulating another person's behavior for what they want. They're not really social words. And if we keep working on language and don't work on the underpinnings of social interaction that they need and those early skills and the turn taking skills that is needed, then it's like building a house on water. It has no place to go, it has no foundation. And so I always work first on the social underpinnings of language before I get to language. Even if a kid comes to me who has some language, has some words, and parents always, the first thing parents always say is, but I want my kids to talk. I want my kids to talk. And we're like, yes, we're going to we're teaching your child to talk. This is how we teach your child to talk. And it's so amazing to me that in my studies, when we work on the underpinnings of social interaction, those kids do as well in their language outcomes as the kids who are working on more language skills in the interventions.
That is so fascinating to hear. I think it's such a really important, valuable distinction to make that, language is a social behavior. So if we have difficulties, delays, or have a hard time getting children to kind of get into that dyadic relationship with another person to use that language from the way, we would want them to communicate, then you have those words, but they don't really. I love your analogy of the house on water, is that what you mentioned? Where do you go from there in terms of building it up or building it out?
Sometimes it's hard for people to understand. And
Mhm.
I know one of my doctoral students, Erin Kozlowski, and I started just talking about it as sharing. We need to share. And I think people are beginning to, I'm finding people are understanding the idea that we're sharing something together versus it's just asking you to give me things, right? And because when kids are talking, they're like, well, that's social. They're asking me questions. It's between two people. So lately I've been working with the idea of calling it shared. Are they sharing with us? Are they sharing objects and items and interactions? And is there reciprocity back and forth in that as they get older in that conversation?
I love that. I'm thinking about making note here, thinking about bi-directional kind of back and forth, and even more so that reciprocity. I'm wondering if there's a difference between something being bi-directional, they're just saying something to us and we might be listening, but it doesn't kind of get to that reciprocity where we might be expanding on it a little bit more or enriching it a little bit more to continue to dig into those conversations. But I love the thought of that, in NDBIs, shared engagement, shared control, shared attention. It's that togetherness, that co-constructing of everything, and really getting people to understand. I can think of numerous children who, one way, request something that they want, or maybe tell me something, but there is no follow-up. There's not that back and forth serve and return, if you will, happening.
Exactly.
And it's
Exactly.
stunted. It only goes so far. And it gets some communication, but it doesn't get to where we would want to kind of keep expanding it and diversifying it. Are there skills that you can think of that you mentioned that kind of social underpinning? What skills would that look like for people who might be new to this kind of a conversation that we would want to have supported before we get into some of the more formal language?
So the way that I've been describing it more recently is building blocks of social communication. And they're additive, right? So when a baby is 2 months of age, they do the social smile. They orient to somebody and they look at them and they look at their eyes. And then there's the back and forth, the proto conversation. So the
Mhm.
babbling back and forth. So that's the beginning of conversation, right? And that's the 2 month old level. And that's the bottom of
Yep.
the stack, right? And then begins the engaging in social routine, something that you talk so much about and has just wrote a wonderful book about. So we're so excited to get. Yeah. And that's also when they begin to look in the direction of somebody else. And so they're really showing when somebody begins to look in the direction of somebody else, right? They're like, oh, I know that they can be looking at anything that I'm looking at, but they're looking at something else. So it's kind of the very beginning of theory of mind in a sense. If I can follow your direction, I know that you have attention that's different than my attention, right? So that's really an important skill there. Um, Then we get to beginning the imitation, which is harder for kids. I like to start with imitating the kids, and when they have the underlying social skills of imitation, and they're ready for imitation, they begin to laugh. They begin to realize that you're imitating them, and it's like, wow, this is funny, and then becomes more of the joint attention skills, the sharing attention, the pointing. Again, very important as that they're understanding perceptions are different, and they want to change what your perception is because they want to share something with you. So that's really, really important. And so it's the really, those earlier skills that I talked about are the building blocks for that joint attention and that sharing attention. And if you can get that reciprocal back and forth in terms of turn taking, even vocal turn taking, not words, right? Vocal turn taking and social sensory routines and those types of things. And routines are so important because, as you know, right, you don't have objects. So they're not focusing on anything except the other person. There's a shared interaction. Bruner, who really taught us so much about language, he talked about everything is about peekaboo. He wrote a whole book about peekaboo, right? That's the beginning of language, that you take turns, you understand the other person, and then you have role reversibility, right? You know that there's and that's very, very important, again, for perspective taking and those kinds of things. And so those are the real early skills that bring that social engagement between two people before you bring in objects, and then you try to do the joint attention with the objects.
And I
And
just
I get that
deeply
question.
appreciate that very succinct analysis because it highlights something I find sometimes within the field of ABA. We jump into imitation programs, which, is like a watch and do. But what's missing is that that child is orienting or attending to the other person to watch them to imitate the model. And then we see the prompting coming in. Again, you get into assent, consent, autonomy. I shouldn't have to put my hands on you to help you do something. If the motivation and attention is there, and you notice that I am imitating you, reciprocal imitation training, and you are imitating me, it kind of cleans that up. But getting that social gaze and looking at other people and just being aware of that, like I said, that role reversibility is such an important precursor or a prerequisite skill almost to imitation. So working on the right things in the right order is going to make it more efficient, right? For supporting learning.
Right. It makes it, well, if you believe that development is important, right, and the developmental trajectory is there for a reason, then you're not creating holes in the knowledge, right? You're not trying to get a skill that's too high for the child's developmental ability. So I think
Yeah.
I'm very much of a developmentalist in that way. I
Yeah.
also will say that what's also important to me is that since routines are so important for language and social routines are so important for language, that they be functional. So, when I first started just thinking about stuff around Bruner, right, is kind of how I got into routines. He did peekaboo. And I said, well, I can't do peekaboo because that's not a functional word, but it's really easy to do we're aware, right? Because we're aware is peekaboo. And I always tell this story about I was working in Boston at the time,
Mhm.
and there was a little boy I was working with, and we had basements. We don't have basements in Dallas. We had basements,
That's right.
and he went into the basement, and if it was before 1994, so there weren't Amber Alerts, but if it was after 1994, it would have been an Amber Alert.
Awesome.
So I taught him where, and he always liked to finish his routines. And so then his parents just had to go downstairs and go, where is Peter? Here I am, right?
Yeah.
But it's a functional skill that you can use in many different contexts. And so I do try to take every routine that I do. Once in the beginning, I'm working on social routines without language, and really, because sometimes if you work on language and social, it's two strikes and you're out, right? But
Yeah.
really getting that back and forth reciprocity with a person, another person, and understanding that the other person is fun and can bring you happiness, right? In that sense, and then to when I move those routines as a child develops, because a lot of times people say, well, do you stay there forever? No, as a child develops and gets skills, you move into the next social
Yep.
area. And you also have a book coming out on joint action routines, right? So
Yes.
how do you make those functional? So I see us going from person to person to joint action routines and making those routines as functional as possible so that, well, there's two things, so that they're functional and children understand words within routines before they understand words outside of routines.
Yep.
So it allows you to scaffold their language comprehension at the same time.
And I love one of the things that I love the most about routines coming with like in the ESTM model that I hang out in is that it's that predictable nature of them, the consistency that you can kind of build them up and diversify them out through variations and elaborations. But it's also that role of reversibility that you talked about. Sometimes I'm the speaker, sometimes they're the listener, sometimes they're the speaker and I'm the listener. And it builds that back and forth reciprocity of who is co-constructing the routine, whose idea is it, whose voice is it that's going to kind of help shape what we're going to do together with that. And it's that back and forth for me, serve and return that we just keep going back and forth with. And then we layer in, like what you're talking about, we layer in those learning opportunities and embed opportunities for language as we lengthen and strengthen those jars and trying to open a new routine and just whammy. I love two strikes and you're out, your kid's leaving. They're off down the door, out the door. See you later. It's too much too soon. And as you predictably build the routines and the momentum, if you will, that's what hooks the kids and they stay a little bit longer and orient a little bit more. And then more learning can unfold, I think, in a really organic kind of way where they're
Yeah.
functional and they're meaningful for that child and their everyday life.
Yes, completely. And I've also heard it was Pat Rydell who I heard
Mm.
say that joint action routines are the topic, right? It's teaching about language because you're giving the child a topic, and then you're teaching the child how to have turns within a topic, and so it's also laying the groundwork for later language and conversation.
Oh, I love that. I always talk about like it's a cracker. Cracker is just a vessel. It's whatever you put on it that makes it good. And we're serving up the crackers, the biscuits. Oh my God.
My language orienting, my speech language pathology orientation goes to
Yeah.
topic language.
Yes.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you do a lot of research on that I've noticed is the Pathways Early Autism Intervention Program. I always say it wrong, Pathways Early Autism Intervention Program. And that one, you guys focus on dyadic engagement before triadic engagement. Is that correct? So focusing on all of this before we bring in the next level.
Yeah. And I did not write the pathways. It was Michelle
Right.
Campbell, Renee Hoffman, and they approached me. It was when I was on the Governor's Council of Autism in Texas many years ago, and they really were interested in their program and us doing something with it, and asked if I would research it. And the reason I said yes, and I only really worked on the first six or so units, and the reason I said yes was because, sorry, it says lower my hand, so I got
Oh,
confused.
I don't know.
I don't know what happened. I haven't touched anything. Sorry. The reason I said yes is because it fits my theoretical framework that the very beginning units work on the mutual gazing and and it has the parents do the work. You're not asking the kids to look at you, but you're doing social sensory routine and you're finding the child's and you're looking for where they are to make your face more meaningful to the child. And then you're working on the reciprocity, and you're doing it within social sensory routines. And so, it's all of what we've been talking about are in the first six units of the program. So that's really because of my theoretical perspective. I said, well, this makes it easy for me to use your program, but I will only do the first six units. And in 12 weeks, which my interventions have been, is really only can be the first six units. So I
Yeah.
don't do their later units, and I can't say anything about the efficacy of later units.
But the first six that focus on that, and I feel like it makes sense. Like if you're going to work on triadic engagement, but you can't reference another person, how can you do that 3 point if you can't do the 2 point? If you can't reference another person, how can I expect you to then shift your attention to something else and share that experience with me when this back and forth dyadic is not quite yet established, those
Right.
foundational skills?
Yeah, and developmentally, the back and forth dyadic person engagement happens before the triadic, right? Triadic interaction, when you read the books, right, they say 9 months, but 9 months it is barely there. It's really between 15, 12 months, you're seeing more. Between 15, around 15 months, it becomes, I call robust. You're doing a lot of it and you're using it for learning, right? And so, why are we expecting these kids who have no dyadic interaction to try to have a triadic interaction when developmentally, if you, I'm big on that D piece, right? Developmentally, they're not ready for it yet. Right. So then they have holes, and then you can teach them in a very behavioral way to do a 3 point gaze shift, but it doesn't mean, but they're doing it for instructional reasons and not be for social reasons.
Yes, and I feel like you can teach the right things, but doesn't mean you should, right? If it's the wrong time, like kind of teaching a baby to roll over earlier than would be developmentally expected, well, yeah, you could probably shape that behavior, but if that baby can't roll back over, what kind of safety risk would you be, potentially encountering? Or I think back to little Liam, my son. Beautiful dyadic engagement as long as there were no objects around, the cooings and the smiles. And as soon as he got his little grubby hands on those objects, starting to shift a bit, it was really hard for him to shift back. And it was 8, 9 months when I was like, yep, I'm seeing some things here. And it
Yeah.
really starts to unfold. And then it really, when he could pull himself up and get objects, it was like we lost him. And it took a long time to kind of bring him back into the social fold of working on dyadic and triadic engagement. And I love that kind of the big D kind of focus of, what do infants do? Where does it start? And then where the children that we support, where it kind of deviates and kind of goes off a bit. And how do we kind of bring them back into this back and forth social engagement context for the learning to happen, which is going to be a cusp skill. It's going to open the door for so many other repertoires to develop. But if it's not
And,
there, where do you go?
and it is true when you said, talked about your son, right? So at 6 months of age, so 2 months of age starts social interaction, right? Where, people can even bring it back further if they want to, because kids look at face earlier on. But 2 months is that social smile. So that's really when they're not being reflexive anymore, that they're really trying to interact.
Yeah.
And then at 6 months is another kind of revolution, but it's not a social revolution. At 6 months, kids begin to look at objects and become goal directed and have selective attention. And that's what we autistic children. So what we're seeing is this asynchrony between the goal directed development and the social development. And people see the skills of this goal directed development and they keep working on it, but they're only exercising goal directiveness, right? So they're only working towards that goal directiveness. We have to start back to where that social development is and kind of bring the gap between the asynchrony, right? So bring the social development up because they still have great cognition. There's still a lot of really good things that are happening. It's just not the social development. And, yeah, I was going to say,
No, that's great. I was going to ask you to keep going on about that. That's something that I think would be new for a lot of listeners to really look at the distinction between those two, because I feel like within the field, we'd be focusing more on goal directed and not so much on that social development, which again, trying to get those integrated is challenging for some of our little ones that we're supporting. Others, not as challenging, but still that delay or that drift.
I think a lot of it comes from the fact that most of language development was, and I'm talking not Skinner 1957, I'm talking about really the child language revolution that started in the 70s. And when we learned about how children learn language and those types of things, most of those intervention studies, most of all of that was done on children who already had joint attention. And so we know that you can't generalize to to a different population. And we didn't know enough for so many years about the core features of autism. So you have words, so we got to have two words, we got to have, three words, we got to keep using your words, because that's kind of that language model, but it's based on kids who already have joint attention. And so we really have to like rethink about this and say, okay, if they don't have joint attention, how do we get to joint attention so that we can get to language? And it's a really a real shift in thought for people. But it, and people, you can say, yes, there's a lot of evidence that by working on language, you're going to get language, but they're also getting other skills associated with that. And I think that the language can also be, I mean, a lot of times you hear the thoughts that autistic children can sound robotic, right? And some of that has to do, well, with their intonation and their prosody, but some of it has to do with the fact that they're taught specific language skills without that social underpinning with it. And we really need to look back at the development of language that starts in the social development.
Yes. And I'm thinking of pointing. When people are teaching pointing, I'm thinking proto-imperative, proto-declarative, and I'm thinking about teaching a child to point. Just to point to get something is very different than a child spontaneously pointing to show you something from that, right? Kind of, you're talking about the same thing, kind of goal directed. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. If we go back to that share word, right? To
Yeah.
share something with you, to know that you can be looking at anything that you want to be looking at, but I want to share this with you. I want you to look at what I want you to look at. And that's very different than the act of I'm pointing, because you can point also for requesting,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
I want that. And that's different than, oh, do you see what I see?
Yes. And that's something I feel like a lot of people work on pointing to request something and then they don't get past that. Oh, he can point for one function or one pragmatic, but it doesn't get back to that social underpinning of why else would you be pointing? Danger, right? To notice something, to share something exciting or emotional or anything else in the human range of emotions and experiences that we have. We just kind of, it's stunted. He can point, moving on. But how do we
Right.
diversify it or deepen it or expand on it? It is not there all the time.
You're saying, I think what you're saying, he can point, let's move on. He can point, but you're not looking at the underlying intention for the pointing. And that we know that's from Bruner, we know from Amy Weatherby's work that
Mhm.
when a child is by 12 months of age, they should be requesting, which it might be pointing, right? Pointing the mean, right? The behavior, it's not the intention. And so
Mm,
pointing for the behavior of requesting, or they could be or the intention of requesting, or for directing your attention to something. And usually, when they direct your attention to something to share information, to share that they want that's interesting to them. And so there's directed when we talk about directing attention, it's usually I want to show you that, and then I might ask you for it, or I want you to I want to share it with you, or there's discussing that joint focus, and then there's routines, and then there's requesting. So those are all different intentions that 12-month-old children have. And often what we see with the autistic children is they have the requesting function, but they and
it
the
doesn't
Hannon,
go. Yeah.
right? They call it the requester stage, right? Because
Yep.
they have that requesting function, but they don't have those other functions.
Yeah. And it's such a really important distinction to make and practice clinically thinking about programming for children, having that shared experience with sharing, discussing routines and requesting is really going to open up so many different opportunities for them to have deeper, going a little bit deeper in terms of the language and communication, and it's going to enhance that social interaction. So I find such value in that. And I always think back to we lived in Vegas before we moved to Iowa and going down to Fremont Street downtown and you look and you see things and you got to share it with the person you're watching. Did you just see this? Did you just see what I saw? Or let's go to this casino and let's go gamble over here. All right. So there's all those different functions. But I feel like in terms of sharing things that are really unique, things that you might not encounter a lot, that's a great way to have that experience is to go down there and have that. But I really want to hone in on, you mentioned the intention behind the behavior, like the point, for example. And is that something you could expand on a little bit more for the listeners who, okay, what does she mean by the intention behind the behavior? So different social pragmatic functions, that intent, that communicative intent that we're trying to support. Maybe expanding on that a little bit more, or how can we teach that? Like one example of what that could look like in practice to get out there and start doing it.
Oh, so I think that's hard. The question, the I differentiate the intention from the behavior,
Hmm.
pointing being a behavior. And what you find with autistic kids is that for the easier intentions, they're going to have more sophisticated behaviors. So a child may be able to, in requesting, because that's the easier one, it's the goal directed one, they might be able to say 4 words, or I want cookies, please, a lot, right? Or something like that. But for joint attention, they may not be able to do anything but perhaps do a proximal point to a book, right?
Mhm.
And so there's one issue that when you separate the communicative intentions and the communicative means, that you need to see, not that just because they're using 4 words with behavior regulations doesn't mean they can use 4 words with something that's going to be harder with them. So that's one issue.
Hmm.
But how you teach it is the social is you teach it by engaging in social interactions. You are trying to increase the social brain network so that they want to communicate with you and to share information with you. So so by doing all the things that we were talking about in terms of the social sensory routines and having them look at you and take turns and reverse turns and those types of things, the more sophisticated pragmatic skills, communicative intentions, is a downhill cascade from
Mhm.
social, right? And so it's not that you work directly on them because it's really hard to. So that's one. Once you get that person to person interaction, then you can start bringing objects in, right? And I like to first bring objects in that are you can hide in your hand,
Oh.
because then you have the object and then you can take it away and you can do a social sensory routine. And then you can go back and forth between object oriented and person oriented, because you don't, as we talked about before, want them to get into that object and be so into the object that they lose you. So by using things that disappear, bubbles are disappear, right? Things you can hold in your hands that are there's motivation and creating routines around those kinds of things, then you can keep going back and forth between person and object. And even when I read a book with a kid, I use a core vocabulary and those types of things, but I read the book face to face and put the book in front of me so that I can keep looking and doing together
Yeah.
as well, person to person, as well as the book. So it's really how you set up that. And I know so many of my speech pathologists, they are taught that to do parallel talk and to sit beside the child and to talk about what the child is looking at when the child is looking at. And that's great if the child has joint attention. If the child doesn't have joint attention, they're like, oh, wow, I'm so excited she's leaving me alone. She's letting me do anything that I want to be doing because that's what you're doing. And so, how do you keep bringing them back to that social interaction, that person to person interaction, and then bring in those objects, and then more and more bring in the objects? So, really, as we've been saying, kind of going from that social routine to that bridge with an object in that social sensory routine to a joint action routine.
Yeah, and I always think about sometimes my sensory social routines, I'll use a prop, something I manage can disappear. And it is
Right.
that bridge to getting into the objects with that because it's such, for some children, it can be so difficult to really get them to orient towards us, not knowing their learning history or reinforcement history. And sometimes I think it goes back to the creativity of adults, tons of ideas. But if we don't understand that child's interest, sensory profile, motivation, Maybe they don't like peekaboo. They don't like anticipatory scare type things. Maybe they like predictable, calm finger plays. And that's the sensory social routine that's going to hook them in. Do you have any advice for kiddos that you've encountered that have a hard time getting into sensory social routines?
So I like to make them predictable, use language to make
Mhm.
it predictable, but it can be anything. And so, really, what is a sensory profile? So, I have a therapist who uses lotion and will put lotion on the child's arm and rub, 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 rub.
Yeah.
And now get ready to stop.
Yep.
You know, but
Yep.
it's using lotion because that's what's going to motivate that child in that moment, right?
Yeah.
And I always use a lot of bouncing and a lot of squeezing and those types of things. And it would make, I mean, when I was doing that, I was, during the whole Rafi age
Oh,
when
I
that,
love Rafi. I
oh
haven't
my
heard
goodness.
him forever.
So really, I had one kid who liked feelings of like, I made like
Oh, yeah.
hid things in rice.
Yeah.
And we would go looking for things in rice and make a routine around that. But I put the rice in a big Tupperware so that we could sit between us,
Yep.
right? So
Yep.
really, you know, sitting there in collaboration with the parent, because the parent knows the child better, and the parent will often say he's not interested in anything, but he's going to be interested in something because there's something he's going to. I say he, it could be she. Um, and really take I guess, a very close look at everything that child's doing and how that child's reacting to figure out what's the hook to get into that child and to go into where that child is to bring that child out with you.
With you. I love that disclaimer with you. That's what we're looking for, that shared engagement and being creative. And I think like free operant preference assessment, right? What would they do if they had access to the environment? What are they gravitating towards? What are they doing with their body? What are they avoiding, right? What are they seeking? And then using that information to build those activities around. They like the rice. Guess what's going in there? Puzzle pieces and other things that I want to expand to find it and put it in, or to share it or to shake it. We had one little guy that liked to throw those plastic balls. We got one of those pop-up tents. We dumped them in there, and that was the fun thing because it was easy to contain versus chasing 300 balls all over the floor.
Right, right,
Right.
right.
I mean, good
Yeah, yeah.
opportunity for pointing and retrieving, but I love that kind of really knowing the child, or like you said, talking to the parents and the caregivers about what their child likes or doesn't like, but then being able to dig into that, kind of stretching those strengths. And if they don't like something, is it something that we could green eggs and ham, try it. You might like it. Or we try it. It's the rhythm, it's the tone, it's the action. What small variable can we adjust that might make that jar, that routine, SSR, object focused, a little bit more interesting that we can start to scaffold and build out into a really incredible relationship back and forth, dyadic engagement. Then the learning happens, but it's that foundation, like you mentioned, you got to start there before you go to the higher level.
And as you said that, the other thing that there's so many different components, right? So
Yeah.
also keeping the child regulated. So often we need to use our animation and our what we're doing to bring that child up and to really get that child a little bit more aroused because you really want to keep the child calm, focused, and alert to learn. But too many therapists I see, once they get the child a little bit higher so that they're able to interact with you, they keep bringing the child higher and higher and higher and overstimulate them. And so we really need to know as therapists how to bring a child up to a level that they're going to interact with you and then not bringing them too far up to bring them down and to get them, and sometimes I'll work with people I'm like, oh, I'm going to put you with that child because that child's very under aroused and you're very, this is beginning, and you're very animated, but the student doesn't know how to
Yeah.
shut off animation when she gets the child to high aroused. So it's that understanding the interaction where the child is, both in their arousal level as well as in their interest and motivation, and then using your creativity as a therapist to bring that all together. So and then the other thing that I also have learned that I have to say is just because you've done it once doesn't mean it's a routine. So beginning therapists, sometimes you'll say, okay, you can do this and you can do this. And then you say, well, how did it go? Well, I tried all those things. He didn't like it. Well, he doesn't know it's a routine yet,
Yeah.
right? You've got to teach the routine. And so that's also a piece of it. So it's like you can say, okay, do social sensory routines, but you've got to start slow. You've got
Yes.
to
I
take
think-
a child
Yes. Yeah.
and
Changing too many things at once. Too much for the kids. It's like changing the topic of a conversation. They don't know what you're talking about. And I love using that analogy when we have a kiddo, they want to roll the ball and the staff wants them to put the ball in the hoop. You're not having the same conversation. You're not having the shared focus. You
right.
have the same conversation to be able to engage and relate to one another. And that's a great thing to help staff kind of calibrate. Oh, you're right. We're doing two totally different things. One of you, you're supposed to be co-constructing. One of you has to give. And it's probably
Right.
going to be you following the child's interest and then bringing them back in with you to your idea, as opposed to always adult directed. Put the ball in the hoop. He could care less about that. That's not what he wants to do. And so meet them where they are versus where we want them to be. I think is a really important part of our routines that we do. And then trying to pivot to have that bidirectionality or that role reversibility, like you mentioned.
And yeah, it's interesting that I used to say that teachers who didn't break down their goals into teeny
Micro.
increments. You might want them to get the ball in, but how do we get them to get there, right? So let's not just drive the ball in, but let's, as you said, meet them where they are and let's slowly get them there. So it's really changing how you're measuring progress in a sense. Teachers who don't know how to do that are the teachers who burn out.
Yeah. Or maybe have children that become highly dysregulated, more challenging behaviors because they're not aligned. Things are not aligned within that teaching environment, which leads to burnout, I'm guessing, to have
Yeah.
that there. Yeah, you talked about calm, focused, alert, and I always talk about Goldilocks. I don't see Goldie. Where's Goldie? We're
Yeah,
not
yeah.
quite there yet. Or they get the kiddo kind of ramped up, like you had shared, kind of overexcited. And then I find sometimes we get into this more entertaining versus engaging. Yeah, you're jumping around and they look like they're having fun, but there's no engagement. It's one directed. Kids laying back on the beanbag watching you sweating to like dance to a song, and there's nothing coming back and forth from the child. So I think having that distinction, like you said, that calm, focused alert to support learning. And then within our, NDBI models and this type of an approach, it's so connected to the child. You have to look at what your behavior is doing to that child's response and vice versa. And I feel like it's this tandem kind of dance back and forth where you
Right.
watch, you calibrate, you adjust constantly in the moment. And I think that's what makes this challenging and more effortful for some professionals. It's a lot.
It is. I started a preschool many years ago and did that for a while and trained. I had a lot of practicum students in there. And it was so much harder to teach than I anticipated. It was like, doesn't everybody know this? It's really hard for people to keep all of that in mind at the same time and take progress notes, right?
And data and teeth. Yeah.
Take data. It's really hard. It's doable, but it's just I think that sometimes we take it for granted, and so really how we treat all the stuff that we're saying that we're doing for the kids, we also have to do for the future professionals or the professionals and train them almost in the same way and the parents as well, right? And how are we really looking at training, which is something that you're doing so well. And so it's just been such a thrill to meet you
Oh, I
that
love
way.
it. Oh, well, I could talk to you for hours, Pam. I could just keep going and going. What would be something, advice or tips or a recommendation for anybody wanting to learn more about what you do, language? I mean, you have such a wealth of experience and your knowledge runs deep. I just love learning and the articles you recommend. I love it. I'm over here in my lane and I get to cross over and learn from you on so many things that I wish I would have known. Are there places you go to find research, conferences you attend that support everything that we've talked about here or your research? Anything you'd recommend for people who want to learn more about everything that you're doing and what your interests are?
Um, that's a hard
I
question.
know.
That's a really hard question because I think I tend, although I try to bring it down to my students, because I do teach
Mhm.
university, and I teach this at the university, is it most of what I do is more theoretical and using and research oriented, which I think a lot of the people who are working, who are listening to your podcast wouldn't be interested in. You can always go to my university website. It talks about things that I'm doing and has resources there, or some resources there. I have some videos on what social looks like because I find that even for the parents who we're bringing into our studies, they don't know what social looks like. What are the skills that we're looking for? What does sharing attention look like? And those types of things. And then, I think that I'm looking forward to getting your book. I used to like, the early you're into Early Start Denver, that yellow book, the Early
Oh, I love
Start
the parent
era.
one.
That just brings it all down really nicely for people. And then yeah, so I have to think about a good one for emotional regulation. Of
Yeah.
course, the CERT model talks a lot about emotional regulation, but in yeah, so
Yeah, I love it. So I'll link your website. I'm going to link some of your articles that I love. You have so many. I'll just give a couple out there if people can get into it. And I'm going to sign up if you have a remote class. I'm going to sign up to join it because this topic is so incredible. And I feel like you just went deep down into the vault and you just have layered and layered your learning and experience to just keep cultivating the amazing research that you do today. And that comes from your vast experience. And I just love it. Like, I feel like that's something you can't just pick up a
I
book
have
and get.
I haven't been able to shift response sets in 50 years, and I've just been studying the same thing over and over and
But
over
you're
again.
digging deeper and you're diversifying, right? And that's what's been really incredible. And it's just such a unique research area that you're doing. That's why I feel like I got to go to your stuff to really learn it and how you bring in Bruner. And it's just incredible the way you've laid it out from a behavioral and a developmental perspective to kind of make it all make sense, especially for the little ones that we support, which most people that are listening are going to be young autistic children. So it's just been incredible having you on the episode today. And I can't wait to keep reading more and learning more about what you're doing. And I'm excited for your upcoming webinar that will be out there. Again, all of this great stuff to get to listen and learn from you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you
Thank
so
you.
much. It was great
It's
having you.
a privilege to get to know you in the last few months. And I said to my students, I met you through you're inviting me to the conference, which was so wonderful. And then we just had this love fest, It's
I just
I thought
love
you
it.
talked language.
I
So
cannot get off the phone. I'm like, I could talk to her for 2 more hours and I would. And oh my gosh, I learned so much. I love our bi-directional sharing of ideas and creativity. It's been so reinforcing for me professionally, to get to bounce ideas off of you and get to listen from you and just keep honing my skills. I don't have a lot of places I go to really level up. And I feel like with you, I have so many different avenues to really learn and calibrate that are going to influence my practice and for the people that are listening as well. So, again, thank you so much for your time.
thank you. It's been an honor and a privilege to be here.